Hello and welcome to the Thursday, July 3rd, 2025 edition of the SANS Internet Storm Center's Stormcast. My name is Johannes Ulrich, and this episode is brought to you by the SANS.edu Bachelor's Degree Program in Applied Cybersecurity, and it is recorded in Berlin, Germany. Well, sadly, to start out with, we do have a new vulnerability in the good old Linux command sudo. This vulnerability was found by Rich Murch with a Strata scale. It is relatively easy to exploit. Rich, also as part of his blog post, did provide a proof of concept exploit for this particular vulnerability. Patches have been made available for all current Linux distributions. As far as I can tell, some of the older ones are actually not vulnerable, as this particular vulnerability was introduced in a more recent version of sudo. The problem with this vulnerability is the change root option. Now, the root in change root, of course, has nothing to do with the root user. It's meant to run the command in a more restricted environment. The problem is that that may give the person running the command actually the ability to map some files that the user may change to files that sudo will then use and execute. And that's sort of really the problem that has to be addressed in the patch for this vulnerability. Again, proof of concept exploit is available. Exploitation isn't all that difficult. Not 100% clear which exact version and distribution is vulnerable or not vulnerable. But in order to exploit the vulnerability, an attacker would just need to have access to any account on the system. The attacker does not need to have access to an account with some kind of restricted sudo privileges. That has been a common issue in the past, where administrators try to restrict sudo to certain commands for certain users, but these restrictions were then bypassed. That's not the case here. Any user on the system will be able to execute commands as root, no matter what their sudo configuration looks like, as long as the version of sudo is vulnerable. Well, and next, we do have a flaw in a very common file format, ZIP files. ZIP files, compressed files, of course. It's a fairly old file format, and Hack Arcana in a blog post noted an interesting ambiguity. The end of central directory record on the central directory itself has the number of entries, basically different files contained in a ZIP file, and then they also have a length of the directory. Now, turns out some software uses the number of entries, and other software uses the length to figure out how many files are contained in a particular ZIP archive. What this leads to is that if these two entries don't agree, then different software may actually give you different results as to what files are contained in a ZIP archive. If you know a victim uses particular software, of course, that could be used to fool the victim into opening a file that may not have been properly inspected prior, because whatever software used to inspect the file did not parse the ZIP archive the same way as the victim. There are a couple other interesting attack possibilities that are outlined in the blog post, but essentially you have inconsistent behavior. Different users, different software may see different content in a ZIP file. Yeah, and given that this is sort of part of the standard, there's of course no universal fix for this. Pretty much just be consistent in your implementations, that they all interpret ZIP files the same way. And maybe if you do run into files where these two records don't agree, then don't parse them. Some implementations apparently give you some warning if that's the case. And we got critical updates from Cisco, in particular for the Unified Communication Manager. One of Cisco's favorite vulnerabilities, static SSH credentials. These static SSH credentials for root, I guess, were supposed to be reserved for development, but ended up in productions. And with those credentials, any attacker could just log in. The user is not able to alter or remove those credentials other than by applying the latest patch. Well, and that's it for today. As announced earlier this week, or actually last week, there will be no podcast tomorrow. The next podcast will be on Monday. So thanks for listening, and talk to you on Monday. Bye.